want to welcome everybody. We're going to be talking about the user stories. And in this particular session, we're going to be trying to finish up the user stories for the developers. And if we get through those, we'll start on the ones for authority providers. But I think the goal for today is really just to get through the developer ones. So one thing I noticed last time when we were talking is that sometimes we have a tendency to get down into the details of a particular topic. And I just wanted to remind everyone at this point, we're trying to set the stage of what the topics are, and then we'll prioritize how we want to address the topics, and then we'll get into more of the details. So what I'm looking for at this point is just to make sure that the wording we have in the use cases are clear, and that folks think the use cases are important enough that we want to have them on the list. So we left off last time at, let me get editing here. Oh, I also do want to ask, is there someone who can take care of adding people's names to the meeting page so that we know who was actually part of the group today?
I can do it. This is Kevin.
Thank you. Okay, so we left off at, as a backend developer, I want to identify the search depth to follow in the broader graph in the authority. So for example, as the graph is being built that the provider is going to send back, how many levels deep do they follow the various links? And the example was given as 3 levels deep. And this has, of course, implications for performance if the levels are very deep. And at the very end, someone had asked for an example of like an LD path that might be on the more complex side that would go deeper into the graph. That would indicate that, yes, we do need several levels deep. At least in the setup we have right now, there isn't anything that indicates to the provider how many levels we need to go. So this is something that had to be decided in advance. And this is for LC data, and it does have a little bit more complex structure, and you can see, just to give an idea, so when you're looking at the LD path and you see the slashes, each one of those slashes means I'm going to go a level deeper into the graph. And when you see the pipe, the straight up and down line, that's an OR. So that's the basic syntax that we're looking at in that LD path. And so in this particular case, it definitely does indicate that, you know, minimally speaking, we do need 3 levels out in order to be able to get all the information out of the graph that we're looking to get. So that was just to give some context. And so now I just open it up to anyone who wants to comment or clarify any of the wording. So does this make sense to people?
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems like the example there is almost like a blank node, but I could see it being harder to go like across from one resource to another as opposed to just getting the label of a particular node.
Right, there certainly might be different scenarios. There are other LD paths, like this particular one I do think has some blank nodes in it, but there are some that don't, that are actually traversing a graph through various resources.
So I'm just curious, how is this sort of related to the API? Would this be like a depth parameter that's passed on the back end? I'm not quite sure what's trying to be accomplished here on the API side of things.
So the way this impacts the API is that they need to return a sufficient level of data from in their graph that they return that allows me to make these kind of queries in questioning authority. So it certainly could be accomplished by passing a levels parameter, or it could be that the particular ontology knows sort of in advance, authority knows in advance that their particular ontology has these kind of paths that get to some critical data, and they are going to choose to include that. So as a developer, what I really want is just to be sure that the graph has enough data in it that I can get additional context. And I could generalize the statement to express that, if that would make more sense.
So this, I mean, it's sort of, yeah, it might help to clarify this. I'm not sure as a sort of a consumer of an authority, we could pass that in if that's what we're trying to do with this user story.
Yeah, is it like if I ask for a name and I want to know all the things they've written and the things that they've written's other people's names or something like that. So you're hopping further. It seems qualitatively different than saying, return me the label of that thing, which is however many levels deep the ontology of that particular resource has. And you don't particularly care how well embedded something is, but you do care, you might want to care that I only want to get for a serial the previous and the next. I don't want to get the previous and the next and the next title.
Yeah, I definitely think that there are some data specific ways that this would be implemented, because in some cases it is getting something like this example where you're just getting a label, but in other cases you might be getting something broader, like all the works that a person has made. And that's where there's going to be some performance implications, because if a writer is extremely prolific, the number of works they have done is going to be quite large. And so there has to be some way to mitigate that and say, well, maybe that part of the edge of the graph is just too much unless it's specifically asked for. So I don't want to go too deep into how we would do it and exactly what this would look like, other than to acknowledge that there is a need for a broader graph in order to be able to provide end users with enough information to make an accurate selection. Does that make sense? Because I do think exactly how this gets implemented will bring up a larger discussion. So I don't want to cut it off if there folks have other comments they want to see added, but if not, then we could move on to the next one. So I'm actually going to move this next one. This is another one that's related to language. And for anyone who wasn't here last time, one of the things I did, because the language topics were getting us pretty far into deeper conversations that weren't necessarily what we wanted to have at this moment in time. So I've been moving the language ones. I just recognize there's a whole category of language-oriented user stories that are going to need to be focused on, and I'm kind of moving them down. All right, so the next one is, as a developer, I want to receive a permanent URI for each entity to uniquely identify the entity.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, that one seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, same.
As a backend developer, I want to have documentation describing the capabilities of an authority and how to access it. Yeah.
I got two statements here. One, that seems vague.
Yeah.
And two, if it's a linked data service, we already know the interaction model if we have the URI.
When you say that, do you mean in terms of like dereferencing a single URI?
Yes.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, but I think when you talk about search, that it's a little different. So I do agree this was kind of not worded quite well enough, because I had to read it twice and I was like going, okay, let's see what this is saying. So so how about I want to have documentation of authority search API. So I do know that this was important when I was doing work, having documentation about the API itself, because that's basically how I would do the configurations. Is I would look at the documentation and then try some things out and then go, okay, I see how this is working and I can create a configuration for it. Does that particular wording seem clearer?
Yes.
It seems like we had a documentation one up higher, but maybe it was just from a different person's perspective.
Let's see. Nope, looks like that's the only one.
Okay.
Okay. I wouldn't have been surprised because there are some duplicates in here, but I think that one is the only one. All right. So as a backend developer, I want to be able to query the authority provider to determine if it supports a left anchored autocomplete. I think that was added because some do have that feature actually available.
I have not heard of a left anchored autocomplete so far. What is that? Sorry.
No, that's fine. Yes, so the Library of Congress has SRU that that does that, right?
The
It's not.
suggest service doesn't.
Yeah, it's not SRU, but if you have the suggest service and you start typing, it completes from the left side. So a name title would start with the author, comma, and then the title of the thing, and it narrows down the results as you go.
So is what is required here really specifically left anchored autocomplete, or just autocomplete that doesn't do matching on first word?
So I have two thoughts going through my head. The first is around the requirement for autocomplete. Left anchored autocomplete has come up a couple of times in the cataloger area. And so some of that has trickled down to the developer area, saying that we want to be able to support left anchored autocomplete. But I think there is one for that actually higher up. So that's the cataloger. And that's
if-
search query. The thing that I thought was interesting about this one is it's basically saying I want to be able to query the authority to determine if it provides left anchor autocomplete, which is.
Lynette, I don't see why that is not entirely subsumed by the requirement above it.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it that we're trying to query it in an automated way, or is it just that that just has to be provided in the documentation?
I think it was suggested that there be an automated way to make these kinds of queries, but I guess I would put it to the group, how strong of a requirement is that? For me personally, having just documentation I can read that tells me what something does is adequate. And
yeah.
Versus having to be able to automatically query it.
Right. The way this is written and what I think Christine might have been suggesting is like if you had code that was sort of conditional saying, okay, let's have this mode first if it's available, or fall back to just a general keyword search or something. If and there might be UI. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, that's what I was suggesting. Like, is it that we are planning that, I mean, I'm not a developer, but is it that we expect that developers would be writing code that would have like this sort of if-then logic about whether that's available or not? I mean, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I do know that we're not doing that at this time. That's not something that we're doing. Everything that we do is based off of the documentation itself. I will say though that we don't at this time really support that ability to switch between a left anchor and a keyword search. And that was one of the requirements that I have heard multiple times from folks, that in some cases they want to do left anchored search because they know exactly what they're looking for. And in other cases, they're not as sure what they're looking for and they want to be able to do keyword search. And being able to switch between those two modes is a very useful thing. So I wonder if instead of having this being like an auto query thing, it would just be a better statement to say that as a backend developer, I want to be able to support both left anchored search and keyword search.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest. I mean, I'm not sure if it belongs in the developer use cases because it's really about the cataloger use cases, but it might be just a thing to suggest as a requirement in the documentation that, you know, the types of keyword searches are something that's explicitly documented. And there might be other kinds of keyword searches that we're not thinking of that, you know, might also need to be documented, but like the availability of left anchored keyword search, I think. Lynette, did you have particular like API documentation that you're thinking of as a good example of what you're aiming for here?
Yes, so AgriVoc and OCLC both have really good documentation on their APIs for accessing their linked data search APIs.
It might be like, I don't want us to create new work for us, but you know, addressing the sort of vagueness of the, like that we perceived in the previous item, maybe, you know, maybe some kind of bare bones sense of like, these are elements that are useful in API documentation. Maybe with links to those examples might be something to put forward.
Yeah. So back to the question about being able to support both left anchored and keyword, I guess as a developer, I need to know whether or not an authority does support both of those so that I know whether or not I can provide a UI widget that lets people switch between them.
That sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds exactly like that. That sounds clear.
Okay, I'm gonna switch that. That's more of a UI developer concern. All right. The next one says, as a backend developer, I want to call a provider API passing keywords in a parameter and receive results in sorted by rank order.
I would probably remove the call a provider API passing keywords in a parameter. That seems.
So how would you reword it?
I think I would make it, as a backend developer, I want to receive results sorted by rank order. Because in the middle of the stuff, that seems to define how, as opposed to what you want.
So you would drop the part that's in blue,
Yeah,
and say I want to receive results sorted in rank order. That I could see that.
I agree.
I think part of the reason why I put that in there originally was to distinguish between that and left anchored, which comes back in an alphabetical order.
is
Lynette,
this because we want that, or because it's that way?
Are you asking, do people want things to come back in the alphabetical order?
For left anchored search, yes.
Yes. So typically that's how the left anchored search would come back in alphabetical order.
Okay.
So if you had something that started with milk, and then you had several variations on that that had more information past milk, then they would be listed in alphabetical order, starting with the milk by itself.
Okay.
So you're leaving rank up to the discretion of the service provider, sort of?
And that would be my inclination, because they're the ones who had whatever search index was searched. And so they would have the rank order that came out of their search index. Is there an alternative?
No, I mean, it's very difficult to provide a rank order on, a single keyword in some cases. I mean, if somebody puts in what ends up being a subject like history, what's the rank order of results of that? Sometimes you can probably guess that if someone puts in Twain, they mean Mark Twain, but that there probably is not enough in the API to really understand what the person is after, without just saying maybe it's like TF over DF or whatever it is, term frequency.
Right. I think all indexing approaches have that same challenge. If you only put in one word, it's going to be less effective than if you put in multiple keywords. Is there an alternative?
Well, I mean, since you're leaving it up to the provider, I guess all you're saying here is please do something to rank the results. It's not much of a requirement.
Well, so just for contrast, I'll give you an example. None of the authorities that provide linked data at this point provide any kind of rank order. So what impact that has is that if I pass along a keyword and I get back a set of results, that result is in a graph. And graphs by their nature are unordered. And what that means is that each time I make the exact same keyword request, I could get back a different order each time. And so one time the user might see it in one list order, and another time they might see it in another list order. So minimally, that would be confusing for the end user. And if I try to apply some kind of order to it, the only choice I have are things like alphabetical.
So you're saying that you want the provider to, even if they're providing a graph, to provide either some kind of score that you can use for ranking, or
Yep.
you want, or if there is a ranking, you, I mean, I think what you're asking for is if it's possible for them to provide you results that are ranked in some way, that's preferable to unranked results. And if they're not providing them to you in a ranked, like an ordered list fashion, then providing a score that an interface could make use of for the purposes of supporting consistency for users, that's the second best thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that there's some sort of indicator that gives me an order that I can sort on. Once I pull everything out of the graph, I have a field that I can sort on. And right now, the cache system that we have basically does an indexing process, and it's a Lucene index, and we just take the ranking that the Lucene index gives us once it does a search, and that's what we provide back to the users. And we do some accuracy testing as part of that in an attempt to identify how well is our indexing approach working. One of the things, as a non-provider, we can't take advantage of any special knowledge that might be there for a particular authority. So we just do standard Lucene indexing, which, you know, is often related to how often does a term appear and things like that.
So I think more specifically than what you're asking for is not necessarily rank order, but the ranking for each individual search result.
What distinction would you make when you say ranking?
Well, if I just return your results in what I think are the ranked order, by the time you get them, they might be jumbled. You know, so keeping the number of the ranking on each hit might be the way, so that a developer knows how to organize them in whatever way they want to.
That's an interesting point, because I do think that that is inaccurately stated, because what I want to receive isn't sorted in rank order. I want to know what the rank order is. Want to receive results.
Wait, why? Why would I just want the results in ranked order?
Well, when I send it to you, Justin, after I've normalized it, it is in rank order. But when I receive it at the normalization layer, I receive it in a graph. And a graph is unordered. And so I need a field in the graph that tells me what the order is.
Okay.
And then when I normalize it and I send it,
put in some sort of ordering, like, you know, use RDF sequence or something like that? Like, why are you coming up with another way of doing ordering?
so you would suggest using RDF sequence as the means to—
I would suggest not using RDF, but there's no reason. You just want ranking, right? You want it ranked order. There are various mechanisms within RDF you can use to indicate order. There are at least like two basic ones: RDF sequence and RDF, I forget what the other one is. But you could also put it in in a separate field or something like that. But the mechanism we don't need to designate now. You just want it back in ranked order.
Right.
How that is encoded is like outside of these, these use cases, I would think.
Yeah, so I think that's enough information, but I think that was really good to point out that we're not looking for the data to be sorted as it comes back, because if it's coming back in a graph, it's by nature not going to be sorted, but there needs to be a way to identify what that order is. Does that seem better to folks the way it's worded now? Okay, I will take silence as a yes. The next one is, as a backend developer, I want data to be returned as linked data, allowing for configurations that map ontologies to a normalized JSON format. So that is basically the use case of what happens currently, where questioning authority receives a linked data graph, and it uses LD path to transform that graph into JSON, which is a simplified format that's consistent for consumption in Sinopia.
So I guess one thing I'm struggling with is within the context of Sinopia, confusing your role versus like Sinopia as a consumer. So like, I mean, for Sinopia, I have this not as a requirement, right? Because you handle it for me.
Right.
So where does that distinction come out in this? Like having that as a requirement for you and not having that is a requirement for me.
So here's my thoughts on that. When something is in a graph and we can configure paths with LD path, it allows for configurations. And if things come in a format like JSON, then each one could be different and needs to be handled individually, or if it comes in something other than JSON. So if you could do something similar with JSON with a way of identifying where things are, but
so this is
I think a consistent approach to how things are, data is returned in a way that can be configured is really the key piece. So like for you, I actually reconfigure it, and so when it comes to you, it's still in a consistent format, regardless of where it came from.
Right, but I think the problem is there's two different roles here that we're conflating, which is the role that QA serves and as a consumer of linked data authorities, right? And the role that Sinopia fills as a consumer of QA, because someone could, a linked data authority could satisfy all these requirements, and we would look at it from Sinopia's standpoint and say, that's great, that's useless to us, because I don't want to have to deal with all the complexity. Like, I don't want to have to, so are there two different roles here, which is, you know, the linked data aggregator or meta whatever, and then the linked data, you know, end user application, and they have very different requirements.
Yeah, I do think you could have things with very different requirements. So how would you envision it if you didn't have QA serving that role, Justin? What would you need to come from the authorities?
I want them to implement the QA interface, right? Like I need the simplest possible interface where I don't have to deal with all the complexity that you deal with in QA. So, and if someone exposed to me an interface that involved all that complexity and QA wasn't in the picture, like it would be a bit of a non-starter for me.
Right, I can certainly see your point of that being really challenging, and I do think that authorities are going to have really different sets of data that they bring back. They're based on different ontologies and all sorts of things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how we can generalize this statement that identifies that there is a use for linked data that allows for configurations, but that also, if things were returned in some other format other than linked data that was consistent across all authorities, that would also serve a need. Does that make sense? I'll try and write something because that might be easier.
I'm wondering if thinking of Sinopia as a data provider in this case too. So the requirement on Sinopia to provide data as linked data. I don't think, Justin, I don't think you're trying to push back on that requirement, right?
No, I mean, I've not processed the notion of Sinopia as a linked data provider solely as a consumer. And like I said, I think Sinopia is a very different consumer than QA.
Yeah. Well, I think Sinopia as a class of consumer is not a unique example, or it's part of a class of consumer that wouldn't want to have separate configurations to consume all these different,
it would it would have to be the super minimal configuration that we have right now, which is like, but not things like understanding how to make sense of the JSON of the linked data that we got back from a provider. And like,
So how does that wording look to you? As an application backend developer, I want to receive data in a consistent format that allows for a single approach to interpret results.
yeah, but I mean, again, I think part of the problem is if you dumb it down to my requirements, then you're not going to catch the richness and complexity of your requirements. So I'm just, again, wondering if there are two different roles here that need to be sussed out differently.
Yeah, it seems like you're saying that there needs to be an advanced and a basic. Like if you don't put in a whole bunch of parameters, then you're going to get back keyword, or whatever the equivalent is for that particular provider. But at least I think the way that the results go back and forth should be the same, no matter if you're asking for complexity or not.
So Nate, are you suggesting that whether it's an application backend developer or the normalization backend developer, the API that they would use would be the same, that they could request a different format? Like in one case, they're requesting an RDF graph, and in another case, they're requesting a simple JSON response?
Yeah, but I think it's bigger than the format of the results. I think that it's more like if you want to get all the bells and whistles, you can add more parameters, and the API, because it follows these recommendations, can handle either a basic or an advanced type of query.
This
And
is
maybe
Kevin.
a whole bunch of defaults.
Sorry, go on.
Just saying, on the basic side, it just has a whole bunch of defaults that fill in for the parameters that the user did not provide.
This is Kevin. I started to get confused during the conversation, frankly. And I see that the heading of the section is called application developers, and then in parentheses UI and backend, and the very front section indicates a UI developer versus where we're now at is a backend developer. And I'm wondering if some of the confusion or conversation we're having right now is because we're trying to make a distinction between a UI developer and a backend developer versus just a consuming developer. So the next section is a provider who provides a service, and then, you know, as a consumer, as the developer consuming the data. I think this goes back to a little bit what Justin was saying, is he wants the simplest thing possible. And I'm trying to figure out why a backend developer who was consuming data from a suggest service would want RDF. Or a client developer, maybe that's the better way to say it.
Lynette, can I ask about, from the QA perspective, about the want for things to come back as RDF versus some other format? I'm wondering if it's because we feel like there might be consensus that people would at least provide that if we try to ask them to use a very specific non-standard way that isn't RDF, then that'd be harder to get people to buy into. Lynette, if you're trying to talk, you're muted.
Thank you. I was muted. I try to mute when I'm typing just so it doesn't do all the clicking quite so bad. Yes, so I do think on some level that the using RDF provides a richness that you can have in the way things are expressed. And each authority may have really different needs in the way they express that. And RDF already kind of has that built in. And so each one can use their own ontology, and we can use a way of mapping into it to get that data back out. You can do similar things in JSON, but the implication that comes from that is that the structure might get more and more unique and require one-off approaches in order to interpret what you're getting back. QA does have some access that it does that goes to various APIs that return data in all sorts of different formats. And it basically has to have a one-off module written for each one. And the linked data module that I put into QA can work with anything that can return linked data, and it has a means of configuring it and determining what gets returned.
So Lynette, it seems like there needs to be a notion of search results versus the actual resources. And that, you know, I don't know if we're saying you need to be able to support both, but if you get search results, usually it's a list of URIs where you can go back again and get the resource, versus every time you search, you actually get the RDF of those resources. What are you expecting to get back in a search result?
Yeah, so I think that, and I'm sort of framing this from the perspective of the experiences I've had so far. The authorities that are easier to work with are the ones that return a larger graph and everything comes back in one payload and then gets interpreted. And this is more from a performance perspective. If it could be possible to get back a list of URIs and then use that in order to fetch additional information. But the way things are structured now, that if I went that approach, it would be, if let's say 10 results came back, there would be 11 network calls in order to get everything. One to get the list of 8 URIs, and then 10 more to get the data about each individual URI. And that is a bigger hit than if I get everything back with one network call. So it's not as performant. And perhaps there could be some tweaking in the way that that happens that would make it performant, but that's been my experience thus far.
Maybe then that's one of the new requirements, or one of the requirements that you should put in, that search results are actual resources and not just lists of hits. Because I mean, I would more likely return RDF for the resources, but JSON for the list of conforming hits, whatever it's called.
Okay. So it could be that both of those things are desirable, so I put them on two separate lines. So I want to receive search results as resources in a linked data graph. Or I might also want to just receive the list of URIs. And I just sort of put the caveat in there that there may be performance issues if fetching a whole bunch of individual resources. Does that seem good to folks?
I think that's clear, yeah.
All right. As a backend developer, I want to be able to request the level of detail, which is sort of related to what we were just talking about. So either extended context versus a simple response, and the format linked data graph versus like a simple JSON structure. So that's actually very much related to the conversation we were just having. And in this case, it's saying that I want to be able to sort of pass a parameter or potentially call different APIs to get the different approach. So as an example of how this might play out, if I'm doing an autocomplete, I would be more likely to want a simple response, where if I'm doing a like a lookup modal overlay where I can provide, I have a lot more screen real estate and I can provide a lot more information, having something like extended context would be good. And so as an end user type use case would be, initially I try to do an autocomplete, but I get a bunch of responses that are ambiguous. And so then I decide I want to do a lookup modal, which does extended context that provides me the ability to have more information to make my decision. So how do folks feel about the wording on this one? The only thing I wonder is I think that we now have like 5 user stories that are covering very similar things. And so it's possible that some of this needs to be consolidated so that there's not ambiguity in what we're saying the user stories are. But if there's no objection, I could leave it as is for now and take another look at it.
I can't quite put my finger on it, but somehow this feels a bit iffy. Maybe because from the Wikidata side, I'm more thinking about it in the terms of 2 different APIs as opposed to one API where you say, I want the full thing or I don't want the full thing. Yeah, but as I said, I can't quite put my finger on it. Sorry.
So by adding that statement that this could be fulfilled as a single API with parameters or as separate APIs, does that address your concern, Lydia? And then when we get closer to it, we could be more
Yeah.
precise.
Yeah, I think so.
I want to thank everybody for joining today, and I will see you in 2 weeks. We don't have too much left on the developers, so hopefully we'll be able to finish that next time. I'm always ambitious, and I think we're going to get farther than we do, but I think it's important to get it right. So I appreciate everyone's patience.
Okay, bye all.
Thank you.
See you.